Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. I want to give a shout out to Laura Brarian. I forgot to do that. He gave $10. They gave $10 yesterday, and appreciate that. So yeah, everybody, make sure to share the video, to like, subscribe, invite people into this conversation. Really honored again to host. Uh, what some of you call the co-host of this live platform, um, uh, Abdaljawad Omar Abboud, back for another discussion. I will read the introduction. Last time I didn't do that, and that probably wasn't as stop being a good host. So Abdaljawad Omar is a writer, analyst, and lecturer based in Ramallah, Palestine. He currently lectures in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University. He has written extensively in Arabic. In English, Abboud has contributed to Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, Ebb Magazine, multiple, obviously, academic, journalistic outlets, and much more. And is we could say a regular contributor to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. All right, truly is the co-host. Fair enough. All right, Abdul Jawad, welcome.
Thanks, Jared. I'm happy about the introduction. Although I don't like bios mostly, so you don't have to
Yeah,
render them that much.
I don't like them either, but at the same time, I recognize people probably tune in to some of these conversations and haven't heard other ones, and so it's like, I should introduce you. Kat, yes, I can share a list of books on my bookshelf sometime, or Aboud. Yeah, maybe they mean more yours. We could do some of that. That could be another. We could just do that at some point as an episode to just talk about books.
I mean, it's a lot of books I bought but never read. So I mean, it's not a.
I have read all my books. No, I'm just kidding. So, all right, well, let's start. Like, there's so much to talk about today. So I don't think we'll have any problem coming up with topics to fill the space. Um, Obviously, one big piece of news was recently Hamas agreed to a ceasefire, which clearly had been brokered by the United States as well as other junior partners in those negotiations, Egypt, Qatar, etc. Um, and that has not been agreed to by Israel, which is an um, interesting in itself, right? Because like, you would seem that if they agreed to this alongside the United States, that there would be an understanding of what the agreement was, um and alongside this, of course, we now have the increased bombardment, more troops in the Rafah area. I mean, you can talk a little bit about kind of what's going on there. There's the discussion around the border crossing there. So let's just start with there, and we can kind of go where you want to go with that part of the conversation, and we can continue on.
Yeah, I mean, look, any like any negotiating dynamic, there's always what is being negotiated itself, which is in this case some sort of agreement that allows a respite in Gaza, some sort of end of the war or a ceasefire, whether temporary or not, and withdrawal of Israeli troops, at least as seen from a Palestinian perspective. And from Israelis, the one thing that they really want is the release of the captives in the Gaza Strip, so that the one card, the one leverage that the Palestinians have in this whole negotiating process is taken away, and then they could continue with the war. The problem is that when you're negotiating, there's always an element of you might be negotiating over something, but is the negotiating actor, in this case, for instance, Israel or the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip, what is their real intentions? So, I mean, in many ways, what we're seeing, at least, unfold with Hamas's declaration that it accepts a ceasefire is an exposition of the fact that Israel is not that interested in a ceasefire agreement or in reaching a conclusive end to the war, that it wants to perpetuate this war for months, if not a year, or even years. It demands the release of the captives, but without necessarily reaching a conclusive end of the war. And I think Hamas was able of exposing this to the world by agreeing to the ceasefire based on a paper of understanding with the Egyptian mediators, and put it out there and calling Israel's bluff and its current prime minister and his coalition, and placing them on the spot. So that's what happened, at least in terms of the negotiations. I mean, of course, the working theory, I think, for a lot of actors right now, is that Israel is not interested in a conclusive end of the war. It's not interested in moving away from this war, but at the same time that somehow American pressure, the American, imperial guarantor of Israel, and provider of weapons, and provider of diplomatic cover, would be able to wield its influence and exert its leverage upon Israel to make sure that an agreement comes to the fore. And whether it's the broader resistance axis or in this case also Hamas, I think this is their operative theory of what could unfold, or if there's a possibility for a ceasefire agreement that ends the war, that it will come about through this American pressure placed on Israel. To some degree, like their move of accepting the ceasefire also kind of placed pressure on the American mediators that now resistance is not necessarily opposing an agreement. It fueled internal Israeli dissent coming specifically from the families. Remember when we talked about the families, the growing frustration around the captives and the different, let's say, struggle in the social arena within Israel between different families and different figures of the family that is also like kind of crisscrosses the ideological divide between the right-wing religious nationalist camp embodied in people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and between the impacted settlements around the Gaza Strip or the Gaza envelope, settlements that are largely, they come from like a secular nationalist or a secular leftist background, from the movement of the kibbutzim historically, etc. So that, that earlier fracture within Israeli society around around the legal coup, or what Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu saw as legal reforms, is now manifesting on the street through people who are in favor of an agreement even on the expense of ending the war, and people who are opposed to any agreement even at the expense of never getting the captives back. So that kind of social tension and ideological tension is rising within Israel and creating the fracture. And of course, Hamas's acceptance of the ceasefire agreement and announcing that also fed into this division. And so it increased and heightened and intensified that division at this critical moment. And, there's a lot of frustration going in Israel around Netanyahu's leadership, indecisiveness, even his indecisiveness in terms of actually moving on in Rafah and conducting a wide-scale operation within Rafah, or his indecisiveness when it comes to actually solving or resolving the issues of the captive, or launching a war in the north with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So this is like a moment where Netanyahu is basically holding a lot of the cards, but without necessarily choosing which direction Israel and therefore the region will enter. And on the one hand, that is increasing his leverage, extending his time and power but on the other hand, it's leading to this situation of continuous war of attrition happening in the north and also in the Gaza Strip, while increasing the pressure through this limited operation that we saw unfold in Rafah. That is still horrific, of course, but still limited in terms of where the Israeli troops are actually positioned across the Philadelphia corridor, and specifically, capturing the Rafah crossing into Egypt. And in terms of using or utilizing this new reality on the ground to still negotiate in Egypt with the resistance groups indirectly to reach a cessation of hostility or a prisoner exchange without a cessation of hostilities, at least one that is permanent and one that includes the rebuilding of the Gaza and the lifting of the siege, and of course a political horizon that goes even beyond that. So, I mean, we're in this position. I think for many in Palestine, as we read, Israel's intention around its tactical maneuvers and its position, even in the negotiations or broadly within this war, whether it's on a discursive level of hearkening back to this is a war of independence and existential crisis that necessitates, that Israeli society comes on top again by, sacrifice and pushing forward a ethnic cleansing campaign, whether in the Gaza Strip or later in the West Bank as well. And it's driven really by the spearhead in the Zionist movement at this critical juncture, which is the right-wing fascists that are largely in control of the government and the Knesset, and are the ones, pushing all of Israel in towards this form of warfare that is total, where victory equals getting rid of Gaza and its people, and later on as well, getting rid of Palestinians wherever they might exist between the river and the sea. So, this negotiations and the lack of progress in it is reigniting that feeling that this is how, or this is what Israel is truly desiring at this particular moment, a move towards this kind of strategic victory that decisively ends any struggle over Palestine with the Palestinians. Today, Smotrich, the finance minister in the Israeli government currently, and one of the leaders of, I think, Otzma Yehuda, which is one of the right-wing groups that are in coalition with the prime minister, wrote that Israel, since 75 years, is still fighting for its independence, largely because the struggle over Palestine, even after the declaration of the independence of the state of Israel, in the eyes of Smotrich, has never ended, and can only be ended by ending the Palestinian presence. And I think this is something that is important to actually position at the center of the current campaign and at the center of how we view it politically, not only in terms of speaking of it as genocide or ethnic cleansing, but in how Israel is trying or attempting through different tactics, policies, techniques of power to enact a wide-scale, decisive campaign that ends Palestinian presence. It doesn't mean that it will, achieve it, but it means that partially, at least, or largely, what's driving the Israeli agenda for the past 6 months is this belief and is this rational calculation that October 7th opened some sort of opportunity for Israel's military to showcase its ability to inflict horror, but at the same time moving beyond punishment and revenge in rationally reaching a conclusive end. And that's why I think the chances for a real agreement will remain low, because if that's what your intention is, if that's what you think total victory would mean, you will only agree to an agreement that is limited in scope, or one that is very reversible, in which you would extract from the resistance whatever leverage they have, now condensed in terms of the captives they have, and eventually continue with this war in a way that attempts to render Gaza mute, and also all of Palestinians in historic Palestine between the rivers of the sea also mute. So this is the problematic, and this is, I think, how also the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip is reading this in many ways, and that's why partially they called Israel's bluff, and they said, we agreed to the agreement, now yalla, come and let's talk and reach an agreement that ends the war and builds a new political horizon for the Palestinians in Gaza, and of course ends the bloodshed, and includes things like rebuilding Gaza, etc., etc. Of course, I'm here speaking specifically to the Israeli, intended goal of this campaign, especially from its right-wing nationalist, actors that are very influential in the government, very influential in defining Israelis' national security, its outlook to the world, very influential in terms of its, they're the ones largely in the ground operation. They're the soldiers, they're the captains, they're the commanders, many of whom are, they come from the settlements or hail from the settlements of the West Bank. They're overrepresented in these key areas. They're the ones launching a war of, position within the Israeli government, trying to capture most of the important positions in the security, in economy, and and now also, or before this war was happening, also trying to create a new complete governance system that includes limiting the power of the judiciary, which they see as influenced by more secular, liberal, nationalist Israeli, ideology or Zionist ideologies. So I think that is partially what's driving Israel's policy, and I don't think we should just condense it in the figure of Netanyahu as a person who's indecisive or otherwise, like a lot of the Zionist liberals are saying, or some of the critiques coming out of the U.S. Senate, or some of the critiques coming out of even the American president himself, which try to see the problem just condensed in Netanyahu itself. There's something that permeates more deeper in Israeli society, this drive to annihilate and to exclude and to erase Palestinian presence on the land of Palestine. That is how we should view, at least partially, the way this campaign is being run, and even Netanyahu's own indecisiveness within this campaign. Now, there is a tactical political level for Netanyahu in this, because if he does agree to agreement that his right-wing flank doesn't, accept, they will unravel the government. And if they unravel the government, he will lose power. And if he loses power, he's exposing himself to legal problems coming from his past, corruption cases that he's being prosecuted for in the Israeli judiciary system. And if he doesn't accept this deal and defies the empire embodied in Biden, he's getting trouble in or undermining one of Israel's most important and imperative relationships with the U.S. on the one hand, and on the other hand, he's distancing slightly the Democratic Party from supporting Israel in the way it has been supporting Israel for the past at least 50 years or so. Because Biden is also thinking about his re-election campaign. Biden is thinking that this whole, war is costing him a lot. Now we have a student uprising in North America happening on campuses. The issue is not going away. It's actually getting more heat in terms of internal discussion in a lot of Western societies, including in the United States itself. He's shedding a lot of votes coming from, various elements of a coalition that could actually bring him back to power. So in this case, it's about whether Netanyahu stays in power and or Biden stays in power, and there's this this kind of emergent conflict in between. I mean, this is not to dismiss any structural, more material analysis of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel and what underpins it, really. But this is more of political dissonance and differences that are also imperative for the political survival of each of the actors involved in the discussion for ceasefire. And I think, again, the Palestinian resistance have read this layout. They understand the different contradictions, tensions that exist, whether within Israeli society itself, whether in the protests happening on the street, whether in the different parts of the coalition that now runs the Israeli government, or whether also with American and Israeli distance. And I think that moment that we saw where Hamas accepted the ceasefire is one that only amplified these divisions. Now, there is a cost to it. And the cost to it was that you agreed to something. So in any future negotiations, it's as if you've already, you start the negotiations from where you've already agreed. So you negotiate down rather than negotiate up. That's one of the problems with agreeing to this. But at least the diplomatic, psychological, impact in terms of the perception, and it's also solidified any form of, criticism coming from within the Gaza Strip for the resistance being reticent or being rejectionist in the negotiating table, by showing that the resistance was actually the more constructive party. And therefore, for the people of Gaza, they would not be doubting now, at least in terms of the relationship between the resistance and its own larger society, that the resistance, is being constructive and attempting its best to reach an agreement that, elevates the condition, ends the war, and, instigates a process of rebuilding. And of course, a larger political horizon of lifting the siege and anything that comes through after this horrific war. So yeah, I mean, that's what we could say about the ceasefire negotiations and what's happening.
Appreciate that. There's a couple places we could go next, but I do want to. Could you say a little bit more about you referenced it, but your understanding of what is going on currently in Rafah?
I mean, I think it's more of taking over the Rafah crossing is important in of itself, because that's where the people leave from Gaza into Egypt through this pay to get out scheme that the Egyptian government has put in place, and that benefits the pockets of its elites, and that's one of the elements of Egyptian relationship to the Rafah crossing, which in general, or to Gaza, which general is one of the only little elements remaining in Egyptian. I don't want to talk about Egypt and its own geopolitical position, but one of the things that make it relevant to the world has become Gaza. Egypt in many ways is benefiting from the situation that is happening in Gaza. What I mean by Egypt is its ruling elite. I don't mean the Egyptian people, but in many ways, taking over the crossing has this kind of symbolic, element. Has this element of a practical leverage that relates to what comes in and goes out. Although I'm qualifying that by saying that the crossing has always been indirectly controlled by Israel. Anybody that goes in and out through that crossing is known to Israel. Who can go out and in is also known to Israel. So in many ways, it's one that is directly coordinated with the Israelis all the time, and also all the aid coming in from Egypt into Gaza is checked through security checks by the Israeli military itself. So there's no real consequences in terms of Israel coming in, except this kind of symbolic element. But one of the Israeli plans moving forward in the Gaza Strip was it's going to build this Nitzariim corridor, which crosses the Wadi Gaza area and separates the north from the south. And they wanted to also destroy a huge parts of the built-up environment close to the armistice line that separates the settlements of the Gaza envelope from the Gaza Strip. So they've destroyed a lot of houses and buildings, to create some sort of buffer zone between, the Israeli settlements beyond the armistice line and the Gaza Strip proper. And one of the running operational elements is to take what is called the Philadelphia corridor that separates Egypt from the Gaza Strip. They met some, according to reports, they met some sort of Egyptian resistance to that. And their idea is that they need to sever Gaza from Egypt in a way that would prevent, the smuggling of weapons or material, etc., into the Gaza Strip, and create much more bigger hurdles for any form of resistance to continue and persevere in the Gaza Strip, or to develop and innovate and create, as we've talked repeatedly throughout the show. So that's one of the, at least, elements that the Israelis are intending through this limited operation, but they haven't still taken the corridor. So it's still like a highly limited operation, much more about symbolic victory, and much more showing, after Hamas's acceptance of the ceasefire, that it wants to create some sort of move on the ground to leverage its own position on the ground in terms of negotiations, playing on the fear of ethnic cleansing happening, playing on the fear of what would happen to the million Palestinians that are now stuck in the Rafah area if a wide, aerial bombardment campaign happens, or a wide, ground operation happens, so that these elements are leveraged into negotiating table, attempting to get Hamas to accept some sort of surrender agreement, rather than an agreement that actually produces an end to the war. So that's part of the Israeli thinking here. And of course, they're also, creating facts for, the Americans. I don't know if they coordinated this with the Americans or not. We probably historically will know later about a lot of things that happened, and whether they were, coordinated or not, whether they were, a sort of, rebellion, like, in colonial history, especially in settler colonial history, there's always, with the settler colonialists, like an act to be more independent, autonomous. In Israel's own experience, for instance, before 1948, they also rebelled against the British, specifically the right wing. They launched campaigns against British officers, killed a lot of them. Terror, also bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, for instance, that left 30 British people and Palestinians killed, including a lot of officers. So that is part of, let's say, the fabric of Israel's own self-identification as being an independent, autonomous power, relying on itself and taking its own decisions, and not caring about what others think, even its closest allies, including the U.S. At least on a discursive level, that's what Israel likes to think of itself, and at least on a level of also how it built its own mythology about the new Hebrew, the Jewish warrior that would not necessarily take orders from anybody, but be able to take his own decisions, or whether this was coordinated form of action. I don't know, but what I can say is that until this moment, it's applying more pressure on the resistance to accept a downgraded agreement that leaves the war open, but at the same time, gets Israel a lot of its captives out. And once the captives are out, then the war can commence without, without any form of leverage on the Palestinian side.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, I'll just say, just watching, Biden and others, it's very clear that whether or not they had specific coordination, which my guess is that there probably was some level of coordination of at least understanding um, what what the United States is willing to accept in terms of kind of working around the edges of what they've called red lines, right? I mean, because Biden said, and the State Department have also said that like the what Israel is doing right now in Rafah does not constitute what they consider an invasion of Rafah, and does not, and so therefore does not cross what they call the red lines. And um and then even, I mean, the kind of symbolic, they didn't send one shipment of weapons allegedly, and they leaked this, of course, to the press, to make it look like, oh yeah, we're starting to put some leverage. But like, as there's reporting out of like, all of the weapons that the United States has sent, that they said would send, are basically been sent at this point. So it's, we're talking about, there's no lack of weaponry. um and so anyway, it is interesting. I mean, I think nonetheless, like, those developments, even if they're not, even if they're still coordinating and trying to sort of play games with the narrative here, it's clear that they recognize somewhat the tenuousness of their narratives, and the need to um, at least create some form of cover for themselves, or try to make it seem as though the divisions or the cracks between Biden and Netanyahu, quote unquote, are increasing, which I think at least is a sign that they're feeling pressure from people, as you said, and they're concerned about, the political messiness of this for the Democratic Party and Biden. And I've kind of wondered at some point, like, how much Biden actually cares about winning re-election. I'm not sure, as old as he is, and I mean, he looks like he's long past time to be in the what do you call it, um
The heat.
well, he's long past time to be in The Hague, for one thing, but he's also, the nursing home. But there's a part of the nursing home that you go when you, like, basically need, like, more intensive care at the end of your life, and that's where he looks like he needs to go. The memory care facility or whatever it is. Anyway, um, I'll say that, and then I do want to bring up something quickly. I know that you haven't had time to really. Um, delve into this, because it's news today. And it's we talked about it a little bit just quickly before we came on air, and I'm sure people will be thinking about it and talking about it. And so I wanted to get your, back of the envelope kind of analysis of it. But there's this interesting article today, came out in Al Mayadeen, and I'm sure it's being circulated through, Israeli press and so on. But that there's this plan to announce the establishment of the state of Galilee and full separation from Israel, um, and that this is going to be announced on Independence Day, and that a lot of this seems to have to do with um, a feeling in the North that, which is one of the things you referenced earlier, that Netanyahu has not done enough, that Israel has not done enough to provide protection to, the settlers in the North near the armistice lines with Lebanon, um, and that, Israel is not doing an adequate job of dealing with Nasrallah and Hezbollah. And so anyways, I don't know to what degree this is, uh, you know, what you think about this, but yeah, thought you would share some thoughts.
I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, look, in the past 2 decades, within Israel's own, let's say, terminology, you had, for instance, the whole Gaza envelope, and it's a telling, word. No, the Gaza envelope. It's supposed to surround the Gaza Strip, and that these settlements that exist across the border with Gaza are actually, in their function, in the way they understand themselves, they are, largely fixated on, uh, you know, the open air prison across the armistice line. That's what it means to envelop something. That you're there to surround it. You're there to barricade around it, and that's one level of it. However, the Gaza envelope in the past 2 decades have become also a signifier of sorts within Israeli society of a place that has specific kind of problems outside of the center of or the heart of Israeli society, which is what is called the Rosh Dan area, and it's the area where most Israelis live, the area, or the big Tel Aviv area, where most Israelis are actually concentrated. More than, I think, 3.5 million, if not 4 million, live there, where life takes a different shape and form, and where, in fact, even how Israel views its own strategic security, arrangement relates to protecting that central area between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, or the Tel Aviv Grand area, largely coastal, concentrated, with a large presence of, Israelis in that specific area. Now, I mean, the terminology of or this pun, if you want, by the Northern Council against any celebration of independence, Israeli independence, which is coming up, is trying to say that what independence are you talking about, when also another community with another security role that is also enveloping and creating frontier areas in relation to Lebanon is now faced with being internally displaced, with economic, unraveling, with the destruction of large parts of the settlements in the, the exchange of fire that is happening across the borders with Lebanon. So it's another sign of this lack that pervades much of Israeli psyche and society at this particular moment, but also historically. Whether the right wing says this lack, the incompleteness of independence, therefore its completeness only would come on the expense of erasing the Palestinians completely, or whether it's through the demands of some communities for regeneration, for dealing tougher with, Israeli foes and enemies like Hezbollah and Hamas, and ensuring the security of the communities, investing in them more, giving them more priority and budgets and tax breaks and all the things that a lot of these frontier settler communities get. Or whether it's a sign of the extent to which Israeli society has lost trust in its own military and its own militarized solutions to everything, which is one of the elements that we should always put at the center of analysis in terms of how resistance attempts to operate in relation to Israel, because I think the center of gravity in Clausewitzian terms, or in is for the resistance, is psychological. It's about perceptions. It's about molding and searing the consciousness of the Israeli society that it cannot win through the exercise of its military power, that it has no other choice but to accept the limits of its power, and that it cannot trust completely its own military or institutions or mechanisms that enable it to exercise and perform this power on the scale that we have seen in the past 6 months, but also large parts. So that's at least for me. I mean, when I look at resistance, yes, there is the tactical give and take, but that's why resistance also makes a video. It wants to amplify, the effect, whether it's for its own, society or the enemy society, or whether it's for the spectator who's looking at it and who's neutral. It's trying or attempting to play or to manipulate the psychological basis of Israeli society. Doesn't mean it's always successful, but that's what is the center of gravity in this case. And we're seeing signs and symptoms all around, whether it's in Israeli art post October 7th, whether it's Israeli culture and how it's dealing with October 7th, of both trends within Israeli society, of viewing this as a challenge that needs regeneration, creativity, power, that needs, ways to overcome these obstacles. So, I mean, I wouldn't underestimate Israeli society and its ability to also come together and pull through and, come out in various ways out of the storm in ways that perhaps would build them in more powerful terms. But also, we've seen the stupidity of power, the stupidity of just unleashing power, the stupidity of not thinking of, how the aesthetics of how you exercise your power would look, how you would also create a moment that will lose you entire generations of people across the globe, opinion makers and leaders, and how you are becoming slowly a pariah state, how when you go to the Eurovision, you're going to be booed, and how now there's student encampments everywhere. That only one sign of this shift that is happening across the globe, whether on a diplomatic level or on a political level, or whether on, south to south solidarity level. Israel is losing much of the support it had historically, and it had largely because it also was able to combine both the horror which we face and we know and we are intimately aware of, but from, Israel was really good at building this myth of the awesome power, the David versus Goliath, the use of its ability to kill in creative, agile, inventive means. It was able to impress, and I don't think a lot of people are impressed by its actions since October 7th, or before that, yeah, or after that. I mean, people looking at what happened in Gaza are only horrified, pure horror. They're not, they don't look at it and say, wow, awesome, you have so much power. Even among, I think, a lot of the Zionists, specifically coming from the left, they would still protect Israel and support Israel, but they're seeing in this some sort of eerie, an uncanny element that they're not familiar with, and that makes them feel not completely homely at this particular moment. Now, it's been the case that with specific communities like the northern community that we're talking about, the settler community on the frontier, that they would use this opportunity to highlight the issue of their own predicament at this moment, the lack of solutions, whether through a more or a bigger or larger military campaign in the north that supposedly will disappear Hezbollah from across the border, according to Israeli military planners or some of Israeli officials like Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, who has been threatening an operation in Lebanon that would lead to Israel, to Hezbollah, to go beyond the Litani River, which is what Israel used to control before its withdrawal in 2000, in the area of the southern Lebanon, what they call the security area, building such a buffer zone between Palestine 1948 proper and the rest of Lebanon. And or diplomatic solutions with Hezbollah. And there's of course an easy solution to all of this, which is, as Hezbollah has repeated, and Nasrallah specifically has repeated every time he spoke, is that end the war in Gaza and reach an agreement, and there will be an immediate stop to our military operations, in the north, and also the Yemeni operations and any kind of operations in any other part within the axis of resistance, and that what they have been conducting since the beginning of October 7th as well. So, I mean, Israel, again, is not ready. There's no decisions in terms of either, escalating the war with Lebanon or, going into Rafah in a very, in the real sense of the going into Rafah. There's this kind of gradual escalation, but then you take two steps into one step out. There's kind of this testing of what could happen. There's kind of this hesitancy running throughout this war, at least when it comes to the other fronts. And I think, a lot of the settlers who were, displaced from the fire happening in the north are displeased with the lack of attention, importance, and care given by their own government, and the lack of the trust that the government is actually doing anything of significance to solve their own problem, including their, when will they return to their own houses in the north, or if they will return to their own houses in the north, and on what premise that will happen. So I think this declaration of we are being separate is because you, the government, have not been paying a lot of attention to us. And I think that's also what's happening with the captive families and all their supporters, is that they feel that the government right now does not care about the captives. It's not prioritizing the captives. It's not prioritizing their release, that it cares more about Netanyahu staying in power. This is the wide-scale commonsensical discourse that is happening across Israeli society. And, and even among right-wing elements, there's an acknowledgement of that, because the way they embezzle Netanyahu is by, you shouldn't agree because we will, leave the government the moment you have any kind of ceasefire agreement, because we want to maintain this position of war. But what it's ending up doing is that instead of the slogan that Israel society has produced in the beginning of October 7th, which is united we will win, I mean, they are fractured. Now, whether they will win or lose, that's a different story, but they are fractured internally, fractured in terms of the priorities they're given. Of course, there's might be some sort of consensus within the military security elites about, military plans of what they should do and shouldn't do and how they should conduct this war. But also the political infighting and the street battles that are happening will also add to the pressure of a society trying to launch a war that it claims is an existential war, under also severe internal divisions, now manifesting at least on some symbolic level with this symbolic pun on Israel's independence by some of these communities, by saying that they are going to become or will become now independent or separate from the state of Israel. I think that is what is unfolding in Israeli society. I mean, October 7th, again, I've called it a shattering experience. And the way for the Israeli psyche to reassemble and to create this moment or to re-subjectivize itself in a way that is constructive to the continuity of its presence in Palestine, is not going as it's supposed to. I mean, there's still an accumulation of a lot of frustration. And I think the deeper, the more time it takes Israel to end this war, contingent on the factor that it does not achieve, total victory, whatever that means. And I think it means, decisive end to any struggle over Palestine, which means eradication of Palestinian presence. But as long as it cannot, through pure military means, reach that conclusion, what will seep in within a lot of Israelis is that there's no military solution to our predicament with the Palestinians. That there's no military solution to our predicament with Hezbollah and others. Yes, we can destroy everybody and destroy ourselves. With what Israel calls through its nuclear deterrence the Samson option, in the final moment, the last standing, they will kill everybody and also die themselves. But beyond that, type of logic, that there's no military solution. And that's, I think, what this war is slowly leading to. Of course, again, contingent on the ability of the people in Gaza, the people in the West Bank, Lebanon, to withstand this assault and this horrific form of power that is being unleashed. And, to wait until these internal contradictions play out in their fullest. And, they've been playing out in the street, and they continue to do so. And I think, the North declaring its independence is just, one sign of that.
You talked about the Samson option. You say, do you think the war is leading to that, or you're saying that's yeah?
I'm not saying that will. Look, I mean, I don't want to, psychoanalyze too much, but in Israel's doctrine, in its nuclear deterrence doctrine, it calls the Samson option. And Samson was this mythic figure that killed his enemies and then committed suicide. And in Israel's terminology, that if our existence is in the last option that we have, if we're dying, if we're the state is completely on the verge of eradication, that we'll take everybody else with us, and that we have the nuclear weapons to do so. Of course, it's a deterrence posture. It's meant to signal that you cannot defeat us, because even if you defeat us, you will also perish with us. And that's what it meant by it in terms of how Israel configures its own nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis the region at large. And that's why they also have or see the Iranian nuclear program as problematic, because if Iran weaponizes its nuclear weapons, if Iran has nuclear weapons that reach Europe and the US, if Iran has the ability to deliver weapons also to Israel, then the deterrence equation, even the Samson equation, changes radically in terms of how Iran could also leverage its nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis Israel, but also vis-a-vis the allies of Israel, and how that would change, the entire configuration of the Samson doctrine that they have. So, but I just meant that there is that element where Israelis throughout their history of engagement with the Palestinians, even in negotiation, there's never been a true effort to reach some sort of political equation. They never spoke in a political language with the Palestinians. They view Palestinians either as people who resist them or people who collaborate with them. So that it's always, and of course they respect more those who resist them. Just very clear. Internally, on a personal, effective level, they respect more those who resist. I don't mean in the propaganda that they spew. They don't respect somebody like Mus'ab Hassan Youssef, who goes out, on media, as a lot of people probably seen, who's a collaborator with the Israeli intelligence, and now he's a Christian in America, who evangelical Christian who hates Islam and hates the Palestinians, and spews and is trained to speak Israeli propaganda. They don't respect those figures. They don't have real respect for that. What I'm talking about is, the security people, the people they respect people who resist them, and specifically people who resist them in an effective way. And I think that in many ways they haven't really spoken with the Palestinians ever on a political language where they recognize that Palestinians have legitimate claims, that they're humans, that they want to live a dignified life, that their own systems of oppression, exclusion, etc. need to be also rethought. That has never been, the nature or the level of engagement that Israel has ever offered the Palestinians. Even when they are negotiating with the Palestinians, they're only negotiating what sort of surrender the Palestinians are offering, what sort of symbolic concession we can garner from the Palestinians, what sort of recognition can we get from the indigenous population of our right to exist on this land, to enshrine and normalize Israel's existence on the expense of the Palestinians, and normalize the apartheid regime. What they're looking for is basically for Palestinian self-negation and abjection from history, and maybe we'll accept living under their sovereignty in some way or form, but nothing of the sort of speaking a political language where there's any form of recognition. So even the ceasefire agreement, again, it's the same type of or the same level of arrogance and stupidity of power, because sometimes power it overextends itself. It's stupid. It thinks it can solve everything through a bullet. It has the tendency to simplify complex problems. If you have somebody shouting at you, just shoot him and he'll be mute. That's the solution for everything in Israeli mentality, and specifically within the right-wing fascist government that we have, which sees that as the decisive end to any struggle over Palestine. Of course, it's not. I mean, it only leads, even if they're victorious somehow in this whole campaign, in a way that ends Palestinian existence of the Palestinian land. There will be eventually some sort of reckoning in the future. I mean, no matter what happens, even in their best case scenario at this given moment, there is always going to be a sort of reckoning. I mean, so it's either a state that wants to live in perpetual war, devote itself to war, devote itself to the art of war, devote itself to the technologies of war, surveillance. Its political economy is geared toward that. So it's a country and society that, as Freud would say, is fixated on the death drive, and whether it's to kill or moving towards death in various ways, exploring various means to kill and also die. I mean, or prevent your own death in many ways in terms of how it uses its military power. But yeah, I mean, I went on a off ramp, I think, but
No, you're good. There's a couple more things we want to get to. Do you want to talk a little bit? You've talked about negotiations quite a bit through this conversation. Is there anything that you wanted to draw out from the history of negotiations between Palestine and Israel that you haven't already sort of covered in this?
No, I mean, I just want to say that there are different histories of negotiations. There's been a negotiation process, which was created for process sake, that went through the Oslo process, or in 1993, and it has a background, of course, and a history with the PLO trying to find some sort of accommodation after the 1970s and 80s did not produce the liberation moment that the PLO was searching for. There were successive defeats going from Jordan to Lebanon, eventually exiled to Tunisia. But what the history of negotiations teaches us is that generally, American mediator is not a mediator. The American mediators are, negotiating on behalf of Israel. Sometimes they're even more, extreme than the Israeli side in terms of what they would offer the Palestinians or not. So they're not honest brokers at all. The second element is that Israel thinks of negotiations only in terms of what can we get Palestinians to concede to. So it opens secondary tracks. It will try to feel who in whatever leadership group, like now it's Hamas. So is there somebody who's more pragmatic? If we kill, the ones that are radical, is that pragmatic person going to come to the fore, and then we can negotiate with him some sort of concessions that are more amenable to us? That is part of the history. It's also part of how you design the people you negotiate with. It's better than negotiating with a force is to actually design the leaders, to build the leaders, or to create the conditions for that negotiations. And that's what's happening, for instance, in the case of the Palestinian Authority, where now the Israel and the US, basically, when they're talking about reforms, or they're talking about who should lead the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, they're designing the form of leadership that they will actually come and engage with. And in one way or another, those are people that are completely amenable, completely, in line with what the Americans and the Israelis want from them or desire. So there's no real negotiations. This is not about, Palestinians negotiating with the others. It's about designing the framework of who negotiates on the behalf of the Palestinians. I'm not saying that this is the case now in Gaza. Of course it's not. Because what we have been seeing is that Hamas has been running this negotiation in a very, astute, patient, not compromising in a way that would hurt the underlying red lines that it has, being patient, not being pressured, at the moment to give in or give any kind of form of concession or symbolic or otherwise vis-a-vis the Israelis, etc. But it's important that a lot of the tactics, a lot of the history of negotiations in Palestine, revolves around, dishonest brokers, um, you know, um, claiming Palestinians are rejectionists when they're not, getting rid of specific leaders and replacing them with the leaders that are more amenable to what you want them to accept, doing second tracks, lying, reversing agreed upon, if you agreed upon a certain framework or a certain negotiating paradigm, after 3 days or 4 days or 3 months or 3 years, you would find that everything you agreed upon has gone now, which only tells us that Fanon was right on negotiating with settler colonialism, that you cannot negotiate with settler colonialism. Or you can only negotiate with settler colonialism if that negotiation happens under, a sort of revolutionary, violent phenomena and condition. I mean, that's what it shows. I mean, that the history of the Palestinian negotiations with Israel is a good example of why negotiations fail from the perspective of those colonized, because you cannot reach peaceful solution without any form of leverage or power, specifically with an asymmetric power, in this case bent on gaining from you symbolic concessions, material concessions, political concessions, reversing earlier agreements, designing your own leadership that negotiates with it, and ensuring that whatever outcome is only the terms through which Palestinians agree to their complete or partial or incomplete surrender.
Much appreciated. There's a question from the chat that I thought I'd bring up. First of all, thank you, Analu, for the support as always. But a question came up of who is the fighting leadership in West Bank areas. And, obviously I'm not trying to ask you to out certain figures or things like that, but what would you say about that?
The fighting leadership. I mean, look, I think I wrote a piece that I never published, which talks about the lack of leadership, at least in the sense of, in the West Bank, you don't have a social political armed movement. You have kind of, desperate parts, and they're not necessarily, at least in any direct form, connected, at least within the West Bank geography itself. So what I mean by that is that you might have people who have a political background that are antagonistic to the current political mode of control and governing in the West Bank, specifically the current, alliance between, an old guard in the PLO, somebody like Mahmoud Abbas, who's the current president, the Palestinian capital class in the West Bank, specifically the capital that is tied to the PA governance structure, the monopolies on, electricity, on telecommunications, on, different areas of Palestinian life, and of course security services and their own also leadership that comes to the fore and are part of this, let's say, leadership clique that we can call, in terms of literature, a comprador class tied to colonialism and amenable to it, and that was also, as I was saying, designed partially or completely by Israel, and goes, if you want, throughout a history also of collaboration in Palestinian history with colonialism. It's not the first project of collaboration, not the first people to collaborate with Israeli colonialism. And there are different forms, dispositions, types of collaboration, and this is just one variation of it, that what's happening in the West Bank. However, in the politics of confrontation, you have, pure forms of confrontation. What I mean by that is like atomized actions, like lone wolf attacks, that don't necessarily tie to a larger, political structure or organizational modality. It's organized through, copycat actions. It's even organized on the level of fantasy in the Palestinian subject. I mean, it's people driving in alongside the streets and seeing Israeli military or soldiers on the side of the street. And in many cases, that was the case, is that that's the moment where the idea of the operation happened, is that just seeing soldiers on the side of the street and somebody just going and ramming them, and hitting them. The very moment he thought that thought in his mind is the moment that the action occurred. So in many instances, that level of fantasy also interplays with this form of atomized action. In the past 2-3 years, we've had the rise of armed movements in some of the urban dense areas. But again, to answer the question in straightforward, there's no leadership, at least in the sense of a political leadership that is tied to this armed movement. The armed movement itself has its own, let's say, charismatic personalities, people who initiate the action or initiate the movement itself, who are more energetic within it, who have ties, or sometimes in colloquial Arabic, we call somebody who's very energetic dynamo. It comes from car mechanics, and we call him dynamo because he moves the car. He's the one that moves, and places the energy, and he's the one that instigates and creates the conditions for the rise of this movement. Of course, there's a larger ecology helping build this armed movement, whether it's social, whether it's ideological, whether it's supplanting it with arms from abroad, whether it's connection to the Palestinian resistance that is more organized in Gaza or outside of Palestine. However, which means that these armed movements would see their own political leadership an extension of the political parties now that embody resistance itself, but they're outside of the West Bank itself. In the West Bank, there's a lack of social and political leadership that can situate itself comfortably alongside, or aligns itself comfortably alongside, a politics of confrontation. The reasons are numerous. Why not? Part of it is because that is the one fundamental thing that the PA would fight completely, is an alternative that is credible to its own monopolization of this depoliticized space that it rules. And if it sees new leadership, new energetic voices coming through, it would ensure that they are fought on a social level, in a war of rumors, in killing them, whether socially or physically, or arresting them and neutralizing their presence. And just to give an example of that, one of the fears that the current PA elite in the West Bank has is that somebody like Marwan Barghouti, who's a Fatah member, would be released in any upcoming prisoner exchange with the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, and he would come to the West Bank. Why? Is because Marwan is from Fatah, so the same political party that now rules the PA. He has some sort of influence within Fatah as well, which is also the party that provides the legitimacy for the current PA to continue, at least a historic nationalist legitimacy for how this current elite both proclaims to represent the nation but betrays the nation at the same time. And that he would be an alternative that is more aligned with the people and their yearning for freedom and liberty and all of these things, and more legitimate in the eyes of the people than the current clique that rules the Palestinian Authority. So they're afraid that a figure who's their own comrade would come out and become a more important player than themselves, at least in organizing a current within the Fatah configuration in the West Bank that could challenge the current elite or the current PA leadership class. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that Marwan Barghouti will do that, but that is part of the fear that moves a lot of these people. And that's why we have a lack, because of corrosion, because of impartial systems that ensure that anybody who's charismatic or has some sort of social presence is arrested, disappeared, placed in this parallel time, as Walid Daqqa would say. So that's part of the policy of also maintaining the Palestinians in the West Bank without a leadership they can trust, without a leadership that they can build around. You can have resistance, but it doesn't have at least a clear political leadership, a clear social leadership, or a social movement that also supplants it and builds an environment that is more conducive and conducive for its flourishing within the West Bank itself. So it creates some sort of vacuum. And I've spoken about this quite a bit. It creates inability for collective action to commence, specifically a collective action that is not on the level of armed resistance. Most people cannot exercise armed resistance. It demands of them, sacrifices that they're not necessarily, willing or capable of doing, or it necessitates a form of lifestyle that, a lot of people would perhaps support, but at the same time not want to engage in more concretely. So, I mean, in many ways, it breaks down the ability for collective action to happen. It creates, atomized subject that are, everybody's living his own intimate life, consumerist, lonely, if you want, where people cannot gather face to face to, exchange ideas or build any form of relationship of trust. I mean, just to give an example, only in the past couple of weeks, I mean, 3 students from Birzeit were arrested. Yara, Layan, and Layan, and they are 3 students who, I mean, they're not armed resistance fighters. Like they're just students who organize a couple of little sit-ins here and there. Maybe even, I don't know if they did, but like they're a bit active or some level more active, and then they're taken and given administrative detention, orders which leaves them in prison for 3 and 6 and whatever months, and completely disappeared in horrific prison conditions. So, I mean, and this is the level of students. I mean, not to mention the level of people who would be more engaged socially on a more bigger level. I mean, West Bank is ruled by fear and uncertainty. So there's these 2 elements that, and this big collaborationist regime. So these 3 elements build the situation where a leadership is lacking, at least in a way that could build. The last thing I would say on that, I know you opened the mic, Jared, but you can go ahead if you want to say. But the last thing I would say on that is that part of the propaganda coming out of the Second Intifada was also trying to kind of create part of the psychological warfare launched at the Palestinian people was to tell them in many ways, look, you were defeated in the Second Intifada. That was the premise. And the second element, your defeat is because of your political parties. And because your defeat is because of the political parties, it's because these political parties are corrupt, your leaders are inefficient, ineffective, indecent, they lack the virtues, they lack social coherence, they lack a vision, they lack a strategy. I mean, you can't imagine how many conferences in Palestine start with, we don't have a strategy, that's the most common word in any political speak, is that we lack a strategy, we lack a strategy, we lack a strategy. And of course, the word strategy is used for everything and nothing. It's almost an empty signifier for whatever you want to place under it. But it was a concerted campaign to try and convince the Palestinian people that their political parties are their nemesis, and sometimes their political parties are the reason for their bad conditions, the reason for the persistence of colonialism, the reasons for the lack of progress on their national cause, the reason for their poverty, the reason for their impoverishment, the reason for their marginalization. It was a sort of and somewhat this psychological campaign, whether it whether it propped up on some level, internally, seeing, things unraveling, it doesn't have to be, concerted, like it doesn't have to be manufactured completely, that this kind of discourse also emanates from society, or whether it was concentrated by counterinsurgent forces that wanted to spell this and internalize us in the Palestinian subject, worked. I mean, alongside fear, it plays a big role in why many Palestinians in the West Bank, do not, they see themselves now political. I mean, when I start my courses in Birzeit, on philosophy or whatever, cultural studies, and I ask my students just a simple question like, who here, for example, cares about politics? I mean, the vast majority don't. The vast majority says politics, is something that pains our brains, and we just don't want to think about politics. And maybe I mentioned that before, but it that intergenerational trauma. But what it feeds into is this kind of this view of Palestinian political parties as some sort of inefficient, incompetent, corrupt, lack virtue, and therefore that anybody who also thinks about politics, or is involved politically, his motivations are suspect. That the person is perhaps looking for fame, looking for power, looking for some sort of self-interest rather than anything beyond that. And that's why it becomes highly problematic for people to engage in a form of political discourse in Palestine, because if you want to kind of engage in that discourse and be authentic at the same time, you almost have to die first. You have to be martyred first to be able to speak from an authentic position. I'm not complaining about it, but I'm just describing. I think one of the elements that makes also forms of collective action highly highly problematic in this current moment, and why the idea of the leader or leadership, at least in the traditional sense of how Palestinians constructed these father figures in some sense, people like George Habash or Yasser Arafat historically, or organizational leaders. I mean, it doesn't mean, again, there are a lot of leadership functions that people do, organization or stuff like that, but that figure of leadership, a person who embodies kind of the struggle, somebody like Hassan Nasrallah right now, or perhaps some other figures, that is also lacking on a highly social level, who garners respect, who garners authenticity, who's viewed in a good light, and whichever figure comes and is seen as authentic, he's assassinated. The last one was Nizar Banat, for instance. In the case of Nizar, he was killed and assassinated by the Palestinian Authority through an operation, in Hebron, that killed him. Although he was not even saying that I'm a leader or trying to be a leader in an organizational sense, he was just voicing, critique of the PA and its policies, etc. And that ended up, the PA choosing to kill him as a message to anybody that would dare, expose them in this very, unapologetic form of discourse, very direct, charismatic, built on knowledge and built on the ability to ridicule and power in a way that, made people convinced and made them also laugh at those that sit in power. And I think that was the power of Nizar that they wanted to kill, and eventually they killed, at least physically. So yeah, I mean, that goes a long way to just say that I think that it will be tough and very hard in this current context of, doesn't mean it's impossible, but tough and very hard to see forms of leadership come across when you have the ability to use and exercise the power of arrest, and to exercise the power of killing in the West Bank in an easy way. It will be tough. Let's put it that way.
Appreciate that. Let's pull up one of the articles you wanted to talk about. So, first of all, just say to folks who don't know, I mean, Josh and I have a long-standing disdain for this publication. So I'm not encouraging or endorsing anything that they put out. Not to say that there's never good pieces that they publish, because sometimes um, they do, but I tend to look at them as a kind of an organ of disorganization and, you know, even serving kind of counterinsurgent functions within what passes as the U.S. left. So that aside, my blanket statement, which will, I'm sure, piss some people off, but that's fine. Um, but this article you wanted to talk about a little bit, which is a piece called "The Palestinian Resistance Isn't a Monolith" by Bashir Abu-Manneh. I probably pronounced that wrong. Apologies. Um, and it's, it's a critique of Hamas, it seems like, and the celebration of October 7th, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, go ahead, just take it away.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's been a couple of articles out there um, recently, and I think our common friend Louis Aldai, informed me of also another article in the Boston Review. And for some reason, these articles are, all of a sudden after the student encampments are like pushing back against support for Hamas. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not in the US or Europe. I'm not sure if people suddenly turned into Hamas supporters, because I would be completely and utterly surprised if that's happening, among the left or among leftist progressive people.
I'll just say quickly, like, um, and it goes to something that Max said on Sunday, which is that for younger generations, a lot of people, even starting around Sheikh Jarrah, um, started to get more information directly from resistance factions via Telegram, via outlets like the Resistance News Network, and um, I don't think that I don't think it's ideological, right? I don't think that there's a strong ideological affinity, right, between the left uh, anywhere in the West and an organization like Hamas or even, Islamic Jihad, Um, but I do think that there is a pretty organic and somewhat sophisticated among what is I would consider a minority of the left, to be sure. Um, uh, just support for armed resistance and understanding that this is um, not only in a sort of human rights law sense, kind of a right of the Palestinian people, but that it's kind of a necessity, like that tactically, strategically, there are not uh, there are not really other options at the disposal um, of Palestinian society to attempt to advance the cause of Palestinians, and so um, I think that there's a decent number of people, right, that follow Electronic Intifada, that follow other outlets too, that, Justin Poder, Anti-Empire Project, that follow the actions of the resistance and that see those actions um, as understandable, as at times heroic, right? Understanding that specifically in Gaza right now, that Palestinians are a besieged people that are being attacked with this dominant asymmetrical power. Um, and that if a tank was roaming through their neighborhood, wouldn't they love to have a force that was willing to fire a RPG at this tank, right? Like I think that there's something on a level of humanity within kind of anti-colonial um, revolutionary, Fanonian. There's this thing that Omar talked about during Black Reconstruction of when the enslaved people took part in the general strike, as Du Bois called it, left their plantations and began to join the ranks of the Union Army, right? That for white people, seeing Black people fight for their freedom alongside them gave them a totally different understanding of their humanity. And we could psychoanalyze that, talk about how that's kind of fucked up and like weird. But I do think that there is some of that. And I mean, personally, I think that's a good thing, a human thing. But I think that what happens is, like, at some of the protests, at some of the student encampments, you do see organic expressions of people expressing chants or solidarity with some of the resistance factions, sometimes even some of the resistance leaders. Um, and I don't take that as an ideological or even political like agreement, right? It's more of a it's it so I would put it alongside people having chants around Ho Chi Minh and the NLF during the Vietnam War in the United States as well. People recognizing that at a certain point, the United States and Israel are throwing all of these weapons and all of this military power at trying to destroy this population that is trying to express its own political sovereignty, and you have to, on some level, pick sides in that equation. So that's how I would characterize it.
Yeah, I mean, I just like I also didn't imagine that people are now Islamic Brotherhood, members, and um,
Right.
that are reading Sayyid Qutb and getting indoctrinated into a mode of subjectivity that is completely different. I mean, I think what I didn't appreciate about Bashir's article is not the idea that Palestinians are not a monolith, because that's, of course, like commonsensical. And of course, as I repeated endlessly, I mean, Palestinians have different political point of views, and that's legitimate. People can disagree about whether to fight or not to fight, even, or whatever they want to like say, which tactics they believe can work, which strategies could believe that work. And there are sometimes problems when it comes to armed struggle among some who end up fetishizing it or fetishizes create this process of fetishization, which ends up almost become the goal rather than the means towards something in of itself. And there is at some level that kind of discourse, but I think it's a discourse that came, it resembles like slogans that come in specific moments, like when the Me Too movement, for instance, says we always believe the victims. And of course, it's kind of a universal statement that is meant to reposition our ears and eyes towards people who are saying that I suffered from, for instance, sexual violence, etc. It doesn't mean that some people or might not lie or manipulate or claim things that didn't happen, and that we should also look at particulars and how it operates. But for some people, when they talk about armed resistance today in Palestine, when they talk about its importance, is because there has been a campaign, a 3-decade campaign since the inception of the Oslo process, to completely pacify the Palestinian population, to depoliticize the Palestinian population, to show that there's no efficacy in armed resistance whatsoever, to completely, disentangle the relationship between Palestinians and their struggle in a way to render them mute and to mold their consciousness so that they remain under subjugation without even complaining about their subjugation. I mean, that's one of the points that also Walid Daqqa talks about in his in his work on the redefining of torture in Israeli prisons, where he talks about the idea of politicide, of not genocide, but of removing the political from the Palestinian subject, so that you self-negate yourself, you become something else, not Palestinian. You become I don't know, an Arab Israeli. You become somebody who identifies with his colonizer in a way. You become accepting and normalizing of your own defeat and inferior position without any kind of will to change the reality in which you were born. So within the Palestinian condition, the last 3 decades, there has been an assault, including by Palestinian elites, including by an entire machine of propaganda, whether it's in Israel or it's internal, to convince the population that resistance has no efficacy, resistance has no utility, resistance will only bring about destruction, will only affirm Israel's power again and again to us. And I think what Bashir does is he falls into this trap. I mean, you can have a problem with armed resistance, just lay it out and say why you have a problem with armed resistance. But I think that it's problematic to me, to say the least, to first of all amplify something that, as you said, that people are identifying with an act, not with an ideology, and these are two different things. People are identifying with people fighting back, not what they're saying while they're fighting back, or necessarily what they believe in as the ultimate course of whatever ideological discursive construction they have created from themselves in the context of Hamas. Although, of course, we should treat the ideology of Hamas. It has its different facets and its different looks. And also for me, I mean, the article says Hamas is socially regressive as a force. It just pushes it like that, but you should qualify. And there are sometimes in history socially aggressive forces, perhaps, that also fight progressive fights in many ways, that take up the mantle of resistance. I think Hamas is just one iteration of many, one variation of many, of a large history of Palestinian resistance that included violent and non-violent, and I don't think this distinction matters in Palestine that much, violence and non-violence. I think people fought from the material conditions from which fight is possible. And the first Intifada is brought to the fold, and I think that's one of the problems with many of the Palestinians, even who are outside of Palestine, who sometimes don't understand that action is built and constructed through concrete capacity to construct it. I mean, people don't see how they can fight a non-violent fight now. I mean, if you come live here and experience the day-to-day life, the idea, the imagination of where you would fight this, politics of appeal, this, recognize my humanity on the basis of non-violence resistance, met with intense violence, as happened in the Great March of Return. They don't find it. I'm not trying to say I'm against non-violence, because I'm not. I'm in many ways, a total, in my understanding of resistance as it occurred, as it unfolded, as actions sprouted out throughout Palestinian history. I don't think armed resistance was an ideological choice. I think armed resistance in its essence was a material necessity. And what I mean by that, it came out of the concrete conditions through which people found themselves in. It wasn't just a choice that harkens back to ideology, and then ideology is the one that forces a certain choice for whatever fight you want to fight. And that's why a lot of the discussion around violence and nonviolence in the Palestinian condition seems forced. It came along with this counterinsurgent campaign that were telling Palestinians, you didn't gain your liberation because you were violent, or because you did that, or you did this, or because your leadership is corrupt, or because you're corrupt and diabolical and you're a problem and you are failures and you're it came as this, form of discourse that wanted to tell us, if you produce a Mandela, perhaps you'll have, you have your liberation. Although we produced many Mandelas, many more than, the Mandela or the Gandhi or Martin Luther King, many in Palestinian history, many Palestinian political leaders. It's just you never recognize them as such, and that's a different story. So I think it's problematic. It's first you've elevated, amplified a Zionist point of view, which is that Hamas, the left and Hamas are somehow in an alliance, an ideological alliance. There was some disingenuous part in the article, which is, with Jody Dean's article on October 7th. I mean, she never celebrated Hamas. She celebrated the act itself, and not even celebrated. She just said, "I felt exhilarated." And I don't know what a lot of Palestinians felt on that day, but I could tell Bashir that most people I've met, and I met at that day dozens and hundreds of Palestinians on the street, I don't think anybody felt anything but a form of exhilaration, like an excitement. This feeling is correct or not correct. I mean, I'm not here to judge it ethically. I'm just saying that that's what unfolded. It was a normal human reaction to people breaking through their prisons before this whole ideological onslaught that was launched on October 7th, amplifying certain parts of it, downgrading other parts of it, attempting to build it as this only as a horrific atrocity against, helpless Israelis, when it was much more complicated, at least in terms of its reality. But for me, for a lot of the Palestinians, just seeing that, was exhilarating as a moment. So, I thought, again, you could make a very good argument why October 7th, at least some are, even among Palestinians. Was October 7th the right choice? Was it the right choice? Maybe they should have done a limited. Maybe the resistance should have done a more limited form of attack. People are discussing these forms of things, but to amplify that talking point, to try to reject and eject, which I think is a critical question for all of the progressive left, is something like this offensive maneuver that happened on October 7th, this attempt by, the wretched of Gaza and their resistance, their organized form of resistance, to break from the condition of colonialism they live in. Even if we question or we want to question some elements of it, even if we have problems with other elements of it, even if we have ethical questions around it, does it belong to the history of the oppressed and their attempts to fight back? Does it belong? Is it a rupture, an event, a moment that we can fold within, various points of history where people attempted such a thing, the Tet Offensive, or whatever it is that the oppressed have created to attempt to break? Do we fixate and focus solely on placing the Palestinians in a place where they have to be perfect for us to support their attempts to liberate themselves? Do they have to be perfect? Doesn't mean that we should, or I think anybody should, say, I give total blank check to anybody to do anything. But it just means that, we have to engage on a much more deeper level. And that's a third element that I think is missing. It's a piece that stitches together various quotes from Amira Hass, an Israeli journalist who works for Haaretz, who does the interviews in Gaza, as if Gaza is all, even before the war, even before October 7th, if you ask two people in Gaza about Hamas, you will have, multitude of forms of critique about their governance, about their actions, about how they've dealt with themselves, their resistance. I mean, the idea that Palestinians in Gaza do not come from different political parties. There are people who are loyalists to Abu Mazen and Mahmoud Abbas, who see the whole entire idea of resistance as ineffective, and we shouldn't do it, and we should just accommodate Israel in different ways and live through it. I mean, Gaza's society is a complex society with different forms of opinions, and of course you can do multiple interviews with people also within October 7th as they're being bombarded, and they will curse everybody. They will be angry at everyone.
It sounds like you're saying that that Palestinians are not a monolith, Abboud.
Of course, no, they're not, because and for people in Gaza right now, everybody is something. There's a bit of anger towards anybody and everybody, including us. Including people in the West Bank, because of their lack of a wide-scale participation or collective action at this current moment, their fear, their paralysis politically. Palestinians in Gaza have anger at the Arab world, they have anger at their leadership, they have anger at the resistance, they have anger towards Israel, they have anger towards America, they're angry at everybody. And I think that's the more normal reaction. I mean, you will ask, so to take that as an example through which to try to launch an attack on, I think what is important for me here to situate is that is the primary ideological means through which Israel is conducting this war, is by tying everything to Hamas, making Hamas diabolical, making Hamas something to be extracted and killed, and through that policy attempting to in fact create the conditions for ethnic cleansing, for for Gaza being unlivable, etc. And what we should expect from Palestinians and Palestinian intellectuals to be pushing against that, not to be pushing against a couple of articles that are celebrating a specific act. And even if you want to push against it, push against it. But your major fight now, your major ideological fight, is vis-a-vis the voice, the ideological onslaught that is tying the entire Gaza Strip to Hamas. And maybe a good way of doing that is not by trying to say, we as progressives, even Palestinians, don't like Hamas and think it's socially regressive, which, by the way, is even among the left historically in Palestine, some parts of the left, they have taken a position which in many instances saw in Israel's colonial modernity something to celebrate. Like they thought Israel and these new incomers will bring railroads and modernity and new technology and a different layout of the land, and that we as regressive social formations need somehow to find accommodation with this with this new colonial enterprise, because that colonial enterprise will also benefit us. There are people among the left, including some of the communists in Palestine, who took that view, and they saw in Israel, a power that will bring social ideas that are different, that will, end the social regressive parts of society. And that tradition among the left still exists, where there is at some level, on a deeper level, an antagonism towards your own people, their belief systems, their way of outlook to the world, in a way that makes you sometimes outside of that society, and in a way launching a critique from the outside into that society, instead of understanding that Hamas has only been successful insofar as it's organized the capacity for Palestinians to resist. That, for me, also through my studies, Jared, and I think this is something a lot of people, they're attracted to these formations not out of also ideological reasons, not necessarily out of ideological reasons, but also out of, what they permit and what they allow in terms of people to participate in the fight against what they see as the oppressive mechanisms destroying their lives. So, and in many cases, large parts of cells in the second intifada, the first intifada, or even, in the contemporary era, like I was talking about atomized action, which do not come from any formed organizational organization, whether Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Fatah, or PFLP, or whatever it is. It's people acting out of their own volition. In many instances, people only in prison choose to become Hamas or Islamic Jihad or to affiliate themselves with one of the groups. And that's part of the organic, sprout out of resistance that also, tells us something, that much of the resistance in Palestine also comes from not a top down form of leadership control that, constructs what should be done or shouldn't be done at this particular moment, but also comes from a bottom up process of people attempting to find new possibilities for political action and exploring them. And in many ways, they influence their own organizational affiliation. Even the human bomb in the second intifada, which was constructed, was also somewhat, not a top down decision. Not Ahmed Yassin, who was the head of Hamas at that moment, choosing this form of action. It came out of cells organizing and attempting to explore different forms of actions that are possible through this combination of explosive and the human at that moment, that came to play a dominant role in the second intifada. And I'm not saying you should agree with it. I'm not saying that it's an ethical choice. What I'm saying is that, we should engage, in a much more spirited level with explaining how these organizations, were built, why they were built, what makes them attractive in the first place. Should we take their discourse, ideological discourse, more seriously, or their social organization and their social life and history more seriously? Should we analyze them on the level of our relationship at this particular moment as leftists or progressives? How do we view their actions? Maybe a socially aggressive organization can sometimes be part or folded within a much more progressive element, specifically if it's a force that is attempting to end colonialism, etc. Maybe your problem with that form of organization would be post-colonial. I don't know. I mean, there are questions that are just more nuanced than, elevating some sort of, Hamas mania. I don't think there's a Hamas mania happening at the left in the West. I didn't see it, happening. I think people are celebrating the act of resistance, something which has been practiced historically by all political parties. And by the way, they remain practiced by all political parties in Palestine within Gaza, because it's true that Hamas is the largest force that is organizing and is the backbone of the current moment, but it doesn't mean that it's the only force in the Gaza Strip, and it falls within it different ideological dispositions, including leftist political parties.
Appreciate that breakdown. I mean, I think one of the things I would say too is like, I mean, what you're talking about, even as you talk about this idea of among certain leftist groups, this idea, even within Palestinian society, that Israel would bring technology, innovation, science, etc. Like, there's this very often. I mean, people have critiqued it. Sylvia Wynter, Cedric Robinson, others like. Um, but within Marxist thought, there is often a kind of uninterrogated Enlightenment, progressive, secular viewpoint that, yeah, I mean, I think it's compatible and people have done good work to build anti colonial frameworks from it. But it also has the seeds of compatibility with that can be used to obviously, I mean, as people probably most familiar with, to criticize religions like fairly in an unnuanced way, which I actually don't think that was what Marx did. If you thoroughly read his work and even some of his criticism around religion. But all I'm saying is that the seeds are there, and like these notions are often based on kind of also readings of Marx at certain periods of his life, without taking. I mean, Marx wrote so much about so many things, right? But like that there were certain ideas, like if you read the Communist Manifesto, that have this notion of, um, we need capitalism will come, socialism will come, communism will come, and that this is a progressive view, and that capitalism, as it moves around the globe, it's going to bring certain infrastructure, et cetera, right? And it didn't have an analysis of like the way colonialism actually, like this was an abstraction. It wasn't at that point a concrete analysis of what does capitalism actually look like when it comes into the colony? What does it actually produce? How does it actually help people in those colonies, um, to liberate themselves and build societies that can be better for them, right? Um, and so, anyways, there's a lot of, I think, debate on this viewpoint that you can see still. And yeah, I mean, I've never agreed with those interpretations of Marx, of this idea that like just because just because some people are religious or spiritual, right, that like you're supposed to dismiss them or not engage, or that there's not a that there can't be, I mean, through the history of liberation theology and other things, like there's a lot of movements that have infused what we would call progressive ideas and communistic ideas and left ideas, right, to use that term, within spiritual frameworks, right? And I'm not saying that Hamas does or doesn't do those things. Honestly, I haven't studied it well enough as a party, on those grounds, but I do think that, one of the things that's happening, which I think hopefully is a good thing, is that for a number of young folks and people on the left, is that they're kind of moving beyond some of these, um, ways of just dismissing things because it's not progressive. Quote. I mean, do we really, what does progressive mean? We want countries to be like the United States and Europe? Like, is that like, I think there's a lot of people who recognize, especially when you look at climate change, you look at imperialism, you look at these things of like, yeah, maybe there are certain things allowed within our societies that we approve of and think are good in terms of like civil liberties or whatever. But I mean, even that, like, it gets taken away when people, I mean, the veneers come right off of that with what's going on university campuses and how hard, these very liberal, you know, institutions are clamping down on people with viewpoints that they don't view as, being allowed within those spaces. So there's a lot of veneer on a lot of this stuff, and I think people. One of the things that October 7th has done, and that this war has done, I think, for a lot of folks, is that um, they see through a lot of that bullshit in ways that other folks don't, and maybe some people still want to hold on. That's what I see when I see pieces like this, is like people really wanting to hold on to like a kind of social democratic, or because that honestly, like when I think about Jacobin, like that's their trajectory as, on the whole. Like they allow in other viewpoints, but it's essentially a social democratic magazine. Its viewpoint of what the ideal society would be something like Sweden, right? It's not Cuba. It's not, so anyways, that's a rant from me. But I just say that like, yeah, I
Oh, Jerry,
understand.
Jerry, you don't want to
But
live in Sweden? That's your.
no, I don't want to live in Sweden. No, no. I mean, and no offense to, I'm sure that anybody who listens to our show enough that lives in Sweden wouldn't take offense to me saying that. So, um, but yeah, anyway, uh,
No, I
there's
mean
always, yeah, go ahead.
what I wanted to say is that like Hamas is used as a scarecrow, like as something to scare people, and it's just surprising to me that at this particular moment you would amplify something, some sort of recognition of resistance rather than Hamas as legitimate in the Palestinian context, and then just confine it as if it's just the product of Hamas. When the PLO, in its secular, leftist-leaning politics, third worldist, also practiced armed resistance and continues, a lot of its factions continue to practice armed resistance. When even before the Nakba, when it was only peasants organized by some of, some of the more learned, somebody like Izzeddin Qassam, who was, a sheikh in a mosque and, organizes this clandestine network based on his acknowledgement that colonialism is a problem and needs to be fought head on. And, the peasant revolutionaries, the revolutionaries of the 1970s and 80s, the first Intifada as a collective. For me, it's astounding that some Palestinians just think the only revolt we had is the first Intifada, and that they only are, celebrate. Okay, maybe the first Intifada was special, unique. I don't know. But in many ways, and that's what I try to show in my research as well, is that call to action that started in the first Intifada in 1987 is what also part of the lineage of the history, part of the possibilities that it created at that particular moment. That call to action is what we saw unfold also on October 7th. For some reason, the secular leftist political formations for a lot of reasons, not some reason, for a lot of reasons, the secular political and leftist configurations in Palestine, dwindled, NGOized, working in NGOs as part of a political economy of aid that is meant to pacify the Palestinians, dispersed, was disillusioned by the political fight. Only remnants of it continued in Palestine, and that the energetic, young, if you want, political forces that rose were Islamist. And just to qualify that, Islamic Jihad, for instance, is like was a birth of Iranian revolutionary influence, Fatah, and Islamic Brotherhood all together. So it has this unique disposition as being, a party committed purely to resistance rather than politics. It doesn't want to Islamicize society as such, but uses Islam as a means for mobilization. You can say Hamas on some level does that, but has a different disposition in terms of how it also focuses on the ideological upbringing of, the subject within its political formation, the focus on the mosque as a space, the creation, of this relationship between knowledge, engineering, science, and Islamist ideological leanings, and also a complete idea of how to organize society in different ways in terms of its various organization and how it runs. And it has a long history in Palestine, even before it became Hamas, before it was Islamic Brotherhood, and it engages in the fight against Israel at a moment that the secular leftist forces were dwindling or dispersing, or for some reason, giving up on the fight. And in many ways, in fact, we can also read the PA, for example, in the West Bank as this old decaying force that is just not allowing for the new force, to rise and assert itself in the political space, and refusing to die, and being this kind of zombie political formation that continues to live despite the fact that it personally did give up on the fight. And therefore, instead of resigning and going home and shutting your door, you continue to engage in politics, but now politics of cooperation. And for me, my own politics is I see clearly that the fault line in Palestine is between a resistance, or a line between cooperation and resistance at this particular moment. And doesn't mean that social agenda issues. There's good leftist critique of a lot of the political formations that are folded within Islamist mullah or within the Islamist tellus. And, sometimes they lack, an analysis of capitalism or a critique of capitalism. In fact, you have a lot of Islamist party that are very comfortable with, accommodating forms of capital, even neoliberal capital. The case of Erdogan, for instance, is very concrete. And just to mention as well, like a lot of Islamist political configurations also in Palestine are, cooperate with the Israelis. You have Mansour Abbas, who's, in the Knesset, Israeli Knesset, who's against October 7th, who's socially regressive force, but also at the same time, I have no problem, at least, with accommodating Israel and working through it and, building this relationship of even backing a right-wing government in its coalition. A center-left of government in Israel, the one that preceded the current Netanyahu-Smotrich government. He was part of the coalition, and he's an Islamist. So you have different Islamist dispositions as well. But yeah, there are some voices in the left, and I'm not here talking about the article itself, but just generally, that historically speaking, who have contempt towards their own people. I don't know. The religiosity of people. Most Palestinians are religious in a very non-ideological sense of being religious, in a much more, if you want, popular sense of religiosity. And it's a more social religiosity than highly ideological or built on the basis of whatever political ideology, political party might have. So there's fascination with European modernity, as you said, Enlightenment and progressive thinking. I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but what's wrong is that what's the tragedy of a lot of these figures is that the very thing they're fascinated with is the thing that wants to erase them and exclude them. Like that's the tragedy of their disposition, their political disposition, is that the very thing that they just want to accommodate and live with does not want them. It's like a one-way love. And it's unfortunate that some people insist on this, one-sided love, instead of maybe growing up and just I don't know, breaking up with this one-sided love, and yeah, that's why a lot of Palestinians also when people talk about solutions like one state, two state, or whatever it is, they're also talking about their fantasies. They're not trying to find a real solution for whatever context we're living in. So if they're analyzing it from the position of I want one state, sometimes it's I want one state because I want to be part of this kind of first world country, highly advanced, technological, etc., and get or garner from it rights and live as a citizen within it. Within the secular space. And for some, it's out of fear of also what would happen if Palestine liberated on different terms, and then you have to reckon with your own internal contradiction, the Islamist seculars. So it's all tied in this talk about one state, two state, and whatever state that you imagine. And there's much more complex thing going on there as well in terms of what people prefer in terms of solutions. Although nobody's asking Palestinians what solutions, and that's important. Meaning that without power, without leverage, without the ability to open the political horizon, nobody cares. And that's the lesson that we've taken from Abu Mazen. He accommodated, he even made security cooperation with Israel sacred. That's what he said. It's a sacred thing. He tortures his own people, arrests them to protect the Israeli settlers and military, and has given a lot of symbolic concessions. And he was promised the state. He was not giving anything except to be confined in this role as a subcontractor for the Israeli state, dealing with civic education issue and ensuring the security of Israel. And I mean, eventually nothing unfolded from that. So I mean, that's the reality. I mean, without power, without people accumulating power, without people organizing themselves to accumulate some sort of power that can fight back, nobody's asking us anything. And I think October 7th proves beyond any doubt that armed resistance is not anti-ethical to people's support for Palestinians. That was one of the assaults. The biggest assaults on Palestinian resistance was violence loses us support. It can get Israel to label us as terrorists. It gets people to be antagonistic towards us. And our image in front of the world, you need to be aware of it. A nonviolent fight will look better, will sound better. It will show us as humans. Many of the Palestinians who are espousing a nonviolent preference for tactics and strategies would claim it's because of the image. It's a strategic choice because the outside world will look at us, and if we practice violence, that they will be against us. And I don't know. I mean, I've only seen after October 7th, whether people agree with October 7th, whether they think it's good, bad, ethical, unethical. I mean, what we have seen is the biggest movement for Palestine in in the history of our cause. After the second Intifada, we had the BDS movement coming out and starting to organize itself in the world. After October 7th, we have the student encampments, we have global shifts in opinion. I mean, I'm not sure if that talking point really resonates with people anymore. I mean, on a level that is convincing, at least. I do think that people, in fact, cherish and look at people fighting back as something that they can relate to. And I think that they might have a much nuanced and complex view of, maybe, the ideology of the person doing the fighting back is not completely my own. They probably have a different social view of the world, a different way of relating to the world, different meaning. But at the same time, that act of resisting mechanisms of oppression is something that resonates with me as a person, and resonates with the potentiality for liberation, etc. And I think, as you were saying, that was the disposition of people. People are not celebrating all of a sudden or becoming Hamas members in the West. All of a sudden, becoming all Islamist. I mean, I don't think that's the case. And if you want to push back against something, push back. And nobody's actually, in the past 20 years, the voices that are amplified in the West among Palestinians are people who are human rights oriented discourse, people who speak a very nice language. Only recently has some voices who are more, let's say, radical, unapologetic, less accommodating, less acceptable to the eyes and ears of this mainstream form of liberalism that you were talking to, have been making some headway, I guess, at some level in the West. And it's only a couple of voices. It's not even the vast majority of voices, at least that I've been listening to, even after October 7th.
Right on. I think, I mean, there's a question in my mind, and I want to pivot to another topic, so I don't want to go into this question, but I'm just going to pose it anyways, which is sort of like that. I mean, I think in the West, one of the things that's happened is that I think there's been a real collapse of liberal ideology in the West. I think that there's been a real, I think that I just think among people growing up from my generation, maybe people a few years older than me and people younger than me, that there's just people don't see any they don't see any liberalism that has any potential to be better than the liberalism that's already behind them, right? And so that it's just not. And so, anyways, I just say that to say, I think that that feeds into how people feel about resistance, um, because they recognize that the order as it exists in the United States and at the war and in the world, um, is an order that needs to be resisted, right? And it's also a very very violent order. It's held up by a lot of organized violence. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that for that comment. Looks like your internet might be a little bit losing some steam there.
Really? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. Yeah, so hopefully it'll clear up here. It's just like kind of your screen got a little bit fuzzy, a little bit laggy maybe. Um but let's try. So the last thing that I wanted to give you some space to talk about, although I will say, like, I don't know how many. I mean, I think among our listeners, and I mean, certainly among me, like the New Yorker is certainly not a place that we go to for analysis, and Zadie Smith is not somebody that we go to for analysis. But nonetheless, her piece was it certainly speaks to certain dominant mainstream discourse that is attempting to um, demonize students on college campuses, demonize Palestinians and Palestinian resistance. And I think maybe we could connect this to also just a conversation a little bit about student encampments and how they are resonating or not resonating in Palestine. So yeah, whatever you kind of want to say there, depending on if your internet holds up.
Like, I think what bothered me, I mean, I didn't want to say much. I mean, I'm not like here to respond to people's opinions only, but I think what interested me in Zadie Smith article is this weaponization of insecurity, this feeling of security among Zionists as a means to mute any form of protest and, and to disentangle their exclusionary, racist, um, uh, uh, and logic of annihilation that operates in Palestine. I mean, look, I mean, there's nothing more telling than having an entire Palestinian apparatus built by the World Bank, IMF, and through the Palestinian elite that I explained in this episode, that is built on the premise that the people who are occupied need to protect and secure those whom colonial power. And eventually, even those people are not getting any headway in terms of even the minimal rights a Palestine might have. Even a two-state solution that would be also a tragic compromise on a historical injustice and a form of pacification of the Palestinian cause in many ways. But even that is not given to those people who are now devoted for the past 16, 17 years to the security of the Israeli occupation and settlement system in the West Bank. This weaponization of the feeling of insecurity belies a reality not that only makes us feel insecure, but we actually live in a horizon, in a world, in a reality where we are both always uncertain in terms of that, is a symptom of a totalitarian, because you don't know what gets you arrested, what doesn't, when you'll get arrested, when not. I was listening to this good interview with a PhD student in the University of Chicago that was on Twitter, and he was talking about how the police raided at 5 in the morning or something along those lines while the students were sleeping, waking them up. And this is a recurring, for example, element of how Israel also conducts its arrest campaign in the West Bank at 5 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 3 in the morning, coming to people's homes and disturbing them and taking them. Part of it's like subduing people as they're asleep, waking them up in terror. In many cases, you don't know why you're arrested. I mean, this is not people necessarily are arrested because they're members of armed resistance groups fighting and doing things that are proactive. In many cases, a student university under a political banner, and this kind of world that you live in, it's the idea that Palestinians would desire to be liberated from a world or from a reality that is uncertain, that lacks freedoms, that is built on their expense, that confines their political economic development, that determines their ownership, that prevents them from having any form of society with more political, rights like freedom of expression. It's natural. I mean, and I think it precedes any other feeling of insecurity, specifically when student encampments are not being violent. They're not going attacking other students. They're not conducting massive court attacks on buildings in Colombia. They're just positioning themselves in a place, saying they want to divest. They have concrete goals, and that's their seeking these protests is to get concrete results and sanction campaign that wants universities, companies to divest from any investments that in this reality that exists in Palestine. And we find people who would find a way to make this perception of insecurity, you not liking that people protest your apartheid, your oppression of other people, as a means to mute the protesters, as a means to neutralize their impact, and as a means to equalize between the two sides of a very different equation. And I think that's what I found this in terms of Zadie Smith article. It bothered me on that level because when I read it, I didn't care really much about her being afraid of an arrestable offense or going to New York or not. But what I cared about is this kind of insistent reminder all the time that somebody's else feeling of insecurity means that other people should be erased. If your feeling of insecurity means that you erase other people, perhaps you should get therapy. If that's what will make you feel safe, is that me and other people like me disappear from this land and die. The problem isn't in you; it's not in us. I mean, it's an issue that is weaponized all the time, also against us, and also we find material manifestation with it in the current form of the Palestinian Authority, to protect our own occupiers for different reasons. Of course, it harkens back to our own history, defeat, people accepting it, being shatters of elites, corruption, whatever it is, designing leaders. There's a longer history I don't want to go into. And at the same time, even though the Palestinian Authority now is protecting the settlers and the military and ensuring that, at the end, the political promise behind that type of arrangement never really materialized. And it's important that, for me personally, it bothers me, personally, to hear that somebody's insecurity or perception of such insecurity precedes a reality of exclusion, racism, of me not being able to travel freely, a sea that is 30 minutes away that I haven't visited for years and years, of that I have never, although it's 2 hours away from my house, of loved ones who are in prison, reason, and whatever the reason. I mean, they shouldn't be in prison, and of all of the conditions of uncertainty and horror and fear that we live in, to sustain the system. And some people come up and write an article that equalize and make somebody who has nuclear weapons and still doesn't feel secure. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what will make somebody feel secure. I mean, and it's not my duty or job to make them feel secure. And I don't think it's the student job to, in their protest, in their concrete demands with their own administrations in the universities, are meant to go and secure. Because if you have a different opinion, or you come from different ideological camp, or you support Israel for whatever reason that you support Israel for, that you should make sure that that person feels good that your protest is basic premise and beliefs. I mean, it bothered me because I think that's one element that has been historically used and launched against us, is that it's part of the ideological onslaught on us, alongside our supposed anti-Semitism. This kind of enforced, I mean, sometimes I feel Zionists wish that Palestinians hate Jews so they can kill us more comfortably. I mean, we just don't. I mean, again, this before in the podcast. I mean, it's I mean, if Jared and his family came here and wanted to kick us out, we will also fight Jared and his family. If it was French or whoever it is that came here, whatever their religion is, if the relationship of coming was about replacing us, the natural thing for us is to fight. And a lot of the Zionists recognize that, even in their own writing and in their closed rooms. So stop using it. At least be honest about things. Stop using these, propaganda lines that are, disingenuous and, completely ahistoric. And that's what bothered me about her article. Yeah.
Appreciate that. I imagine we'll also give Steven Salaita. We talked to him on Monday about his new novel, Daughter, Son, Assassin. He wrote a piece in response to her. I imagine we'll also give him a chance to offer some reflections on it as well. I mean, it's like everything you're describing. I mean, this is just like, I don't know. I have very hard time ascribing good faith to anyone who makes those kinds of arguments. Meaning the arguments that she made, which I haven't even read the piece, so I'm really taking on kind of the faith of how you described it. But this is similar to me of Joe Biden saying, "Yeah, we support peaceful protests, but you can't trespass. You can't mess up somebody's commencement. You can't make you can't make Jewish students feel uncomfortable." Like, this is the kind of rhetoric that he's saying, right? And like, yeah, I mean, like, you just described how not to protest. Not that Jewish students always need to be made uncomfortable, of course, like, but that's not the somebody will always be made to feel uncomfortable by protest, right? Like, that's part of, if it's being done well, right? Usually, I mean, in the United States, it's very often, and this is why I reflect on it. It's very often white people who feel uncomfortable, because it's usually repressed people of color, black people within the United States, that have to engage within social movements in order to fulfill rights, obligations, duties of the state. And so, like, yeah, I mean, this was used ad nauseum against protesters around the movement for Black Lives and so on. This idea, I mean, people getting pissed off about people blocking freeways because, they can't get home from work or get to this or that. It's like, Yeah, you can't be based solely. I mean, you could have a debate about that as a tactic. That's fine, but like you can't be making your decisions based solely off of people's feelings, and yeah, especially when you're talking about the feelings of people that um, are apart either ideologically or materially in the systems of oppression that are actually being resisted, right? And so, yeah. Anyway, I agree with you. I agree with your take on it. Is there anything else? Did you want to say anything kind of in closing about the student movements at all?
I mean, like, well, the student movements for us is, I mean, honestly, in my wildest imagination, I never thought you'll have this like um, movement, sprouting out in organized fashion across campuses in the U.S. specifically, like, out of any other place in the world. And I think for a lot of Palestinians, seeing that, there's a lot of hope, um, feeling of that, um, what's happening for the past 6 months is not going to deaf ears, that being heard, that people have really political opinion is also manifesting in political action. And a lot of people are taking, solace in this moment of political organizing. I don't want to exaggerate its impact. You guys probably know much more about its, possibilities, how it's being faced in terms of, oppression, tactics, physical onslaught, psychic, and as well, like, negotiating and perhaps to fizzle, whatever it is that the administrators of universities and the police and the alliance against these protests, might be able to also confine their impact and achieving or attaining. I'm not sure. I mean, this is a battle that remains to some extent, and perhaps produce concrete results in the coming months or so. And what I do like about this, it's not drawing attention for an issue or centering of Palestine. Of course, that's all important, but it has also a goal in terms of and in terms of looking at what areas do universities actually invest in. And I think it would only not impact the Palestinian issue or the investment from Israel. I think it could also help. Universities are investing in a more wider level, and also tied to other struggles, and whether social or ecological or political in different areas. So I think it's a moment where the young are asserting themselves in different ways. Um, and to me, it's, yeah, I mean, uh, in Gaza, from my friends, I'm hearing, a lot of my friends in Gaza, this is something they're, find very hopeful. From an outside perspective and just tied to the Palestinians, I mean, of course, it is important in the sense that it's placing more pressure also on Biden and the Democratic Party and like apparatus at this particular moment, and it's heightened pressure on him to end the war before closes down and before the. So I think that's also in terms of it's actually concretely helping at least compress the days of the war if it continues and builds up and the momentum builds up. Remember, I mean, there is leverage in the coalition that is built around the Democratic Party and what impacts it. There's concrete leverage you can use now, which will probably be absent if Trump comes in. And I think that for people interested and one to support the Palestinian people, specifically the people in Gaza, that leverage should be exercised to the extent possible at this particular moment. And I think everybody in Palestine is hopeful that that is also part of the equation in the coming months and days. That that pressure and leverage will also produce a better political outcome, whether it's ending the war or at the same time, taking the end of the war as opening a political horizon of possibilities for divestment, for ending the impunity of the Israeli state, for pressuring also from the outside in various ways by placing it as a pariah state that needs to be changed drastically and deconstructed materially for people to have a real liberation in the area between the river and the sea.
Appreciated. I'm sure that we will pick this up again in a couple weeks. Well, maybe next time we'll have something to actually. I don't want to say celebrate, but yeah, something like that. But anyway, appreciate your commentary and your thoughts as always, Aboud. And look forward to more conversations with you, hopefully on better terms in the future.
Thanks, Jared. It was great being with you.
Always good. Thanks.